Thanks everybody for coming. Welcome to the 2017 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series. This lecture series is 33 years running now. It's been a mainstay of Tuesday evenings on the University of Montana Missoula campus for quite some time. And as I mentioned to students last week, we also do have members of the public who come and attend these lectures as well. So it's a really awesome opportunity to not only be here collegially as academics on a university campus, but also to be learning right alongside community members in Missoula. So it's a really great environment. And before we kick off this week's speaker, I just wanted to start by saying, and sorry for students who heard this last week, but this year's lecture series, the theme being Our Map of the World, lessons that we've learned in the past and how it can be applied to our present and future, is a topic that's not strictly wilderness related. So we're diverging a tiny bit from our wilderness-centric theme of what many of our lecture series have been in the past, but it still relates to wild spaces, the environment, and public lands. As I told the students last week, the history of the topic was based on some travels I was doing last spring in a particular region of Arctic Alaska that I consider one of the wildest places. And I was motivated by seeing some caribou on a migration route that's over 10,000 years old to try to come up with a lecture series topic that would somehow pull together things that we've learned in the past, whether they be through academic study or life experience or storytelling through generations, and how those types of experiences, stories, lessons, challenges, successes can help us figure out where we are collectively as a society now and where we're going in the future. So that's where this started. And it relates to wilderness because wilderness as an ideal, as an actual place, has a very prominent path throughout our history that's motivated by society and cultural reasons outside of just the concept of wilderness. And so this is hopefully going to help us explore the theme of wilderness that many of us collectively get together for every year in a lecture series in a new way, in lots of new ways. So to mention, we'll have lectures from here on out every Tuesday night. Our final lecture will be on April 4th. Next week's lecture will be by a fellow in the Mansfield Center, Dr. Kimberly Maynard, who researches post-war societal response, and she's going to be looking at how the environment plays a central theme in post-war recovery across the globe. But for this week, I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Robin Parent. She is a new member of the University of Montana family. She started at the Davidson Honors College in the fall of 2016, just this past fall. She's the Director of Student Engagement for the Davidson Honors College. But she brings a plethora of experiences to our campus that are much broader than just her work within the Honors College. So hopefully many of you will have the opportunity to interact with her. And I would encourage you to reach out to her after her talk tonight. Prior to coming to the University of Montana, Robin spent 3 years as the Inclusive Excellence Instruction Specialist at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. In this role, she participated in faculty development and curriculum change around diversity and inclusivity in the classroom. She has designed and facilitated many workshops on topics such as inclusive teaching, university climate, threshold concepts, program assessment, undergraduate research, mentoring underserved populations, as well as teaching many different courses for the Women and Gender Studies program. Her areas of research include feminism, dystopias, of which she'll speak tonight, young adult literature, mentoring, inclusivity, and diversity. She's got academic background that spans several different degrees from Utah State University. She had a bachelor's degree in anthropology, a master's in folklore, a graduate certificate in women and gender studies, and a doctorate in education. She also taught English for 15 years while she was at Utah State University and taught for the gender studies program. Tonight she's going to be discussing dystopias, and to use the language that she gave us in framing this for our outreach for the lecture series, I'm going to use her words since I was just introduced to dystopias tonight, although not in all ways, as I've actually read just a lot of dystopia literature, some young adult dystopia literature. So dystopias tell the story of a future impacted by a catastrophic past that usually relates to the reader's present. In many cases, the environment plays a significant role in the outcome of a dystopia. The talk tonight that Dr. Parent is going to give us will highlight the relationship between power and the environment in multiple books: Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, Starhawk's The Fifth Sacred Thing, and Scott Westerfeld's Uglies, and how these dystopias provide avenues for engaging and learning about the environment. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Parent to kick off our lecture series. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for having me come and talk with you guys tonight. It's a great honor, and it's really wonderful to be back in front of a classroom. It's been several months since I've sat in front of folks and got to talk and share the things that I get to share what I'm passionate about all the time, but maybe not so much the dystopia part of it. And I realize sometimes people are like, passion and dystopias, how do those things go together? One of the greatest parts about what I have been able to do in my life and what I've got to learn from is being able to incorporate what I really like to do for fun, which is reading, engaging with young adult literature, engaging with children who like to read young adult literature. And what I found out is there are a lot of adults who like to read young adult literature. So it just happened to sort of surround myself with these things that I really like to do. And as I read science fiction and fantasy and really centered in onto dystopias, I began thinking about the ways that I interact with dystopias and how that interaction affects the way that I see the world. Paulo Freire, who is was an education specialist from Brazil, who taught underrepresented groups in Brazil how to read, so through literacy. And he said that you read the world the way that you read the world. And the way that you are and the way you engage with a text is also the way that you engage with the world. And that relates to the past that you bring with you, how you engage with that text, and then what you end up doing with that once you have engaged with it. So I was so excited to get to come and talk about these 3 books specifically, even though there are probably a host of other dystopias that we could talk about. Host could be one of them. That's a dystopia. But I want to give a little background first on dystopias themselves. A dystopia is a time after a catastrophic event, an apocalyptic event. It can be a natural disaster. We see dystopias related to natural disasters all the time. Movies, it's a really great theme. But it can also be after a political disaster. I do have to admit that I agreed to do this talk prior to January 20th. And I was like, oh, dystopias, whee! And then January 20th came around, and now, boy, dystopias have become a hot topic. I see dystopias everywhere in my Facebook feed, in my Twitter feed. I have heard that 1984 is the best-selling book of this week. It's been a long time since 1984 it was the best-selling book. Also, a very scary dystopia. The interesting thing about dystopias, not 1984, is that they take place in the future. I mean, when it was written, it was considered the future. But that's that future that's maybe not so far distant. It's close enough to be relatable, but far enough away for it to be still safe. So it allows the reader to engage with that event, that fear, in a way that they can maybe see some possibilities in it. A dystopia often portrays complicatedness of power, and it's very intertwined. There's not usually one theme of a dystopia It's usually very much interconnected. If you have an environmental theme, it can be from a natural disaster or event, but it can also be environment and natural resources used in power. Who has taken over those natural resources? How have they created a dystopic environment for a particular group of people? We can think about the Hunger Games and the Capitol, right? Those of you who are familiar with it, the Capitol controls those resources. Those natural resources lead to a marginalized group of societies. There are lots of dystopias like that. Another one that we can relate to, probably me and maybe a few of the older folks here, is a dystopia that was written young adult in the 1980s called Z for Zachariah. Z for Zachariah was a political event that created a disaster through nuclear weapons, but it left the earth barren. So in an event in that particular way. So power played a role, but the protagonist actually has to live on her own in that case and has to survive on her own. So one of the things that we learn, or I learned, I hope that you will also learn through dystopias, is that there is an engagement between individual and social action. So I did my dissertation on dystopias, young adult literature, through a feminist lens, which is different than what I'm going to talk about today. In my dissertation, I focused on two groups. So when I say young adult literature, I'm really talking about a target audience between the ages of 12 and 20. So that's a really broad range, but it's usually an age group that is often in the margins. They're no longer children. Children have power in some particular ways, and they're not adults who have power in different ways. So young adults actually sit in this margin of negotiating power. They've lost some power as a child, where they get to whine for things and ask for things, and they're really taken care of, to adults who are actually self-sufficient. In your literature classes, you might have heard of this being a coming-of-age story. So that's a common theme. So for adults who read dystopias or young adult literature, they're learning through different things. They're engaging with those protagonists and those ideas, not so necessarily as an individual level, but more at a social level. So what I found in my dissertation is the target audience was really looking for individual growth. And what action could that individual take within that storyline? Whereas the adults who read it were looking for engagement in social issues. When you look at that and come together, it actually creates a whole. You have to have individual action and power before you can actually affect change in a society. So those are two really important components of what readers who engage with dystopias find or come out with and are able to utilize. We hear dystopia in relationship to utopia. So utopias are, I'll define utopias in a second. My caption under here is, your utopia is my dystopia. So often when you hear of a utopia, it's been something that has been built. It's been designed, it's been created. And unfortunately, utopias are often built upon the backs of marginalized groups and at the cost of natural resources, sometimes intelligence, sometimes freedoms, sometimes the ability to think on your own, which I guess could be a freedom. So I've written a couple of papers utilizing this in the title, is Your Utopia is My Dystopia. Because most oftentimes when someone is like, hey, this is great, this is the way life should be, let's go back to think about Hunger Games and the Capitol. And if you haven't read or seen the Hunger Games, you're like, what are you talking about? But it's a really good example that the Capitol thinks that they're living this phenomenal life, but yet it's built on the backs of all the other districts. So it really highlights that utopia-dystopia disconnect. However, utopias are an important concept. They represent a place of equity and harmony. It's a place where power is equitably distributed amongst its people, where governments, those who govern, are elected, they are held accountable, and everybody within the group feels very good about it. And when they don't feel good about it, there are avenues to discuss that anxiety or that disconnect or what they don't like. So there are avenues in place to still continue and keep the harmony. A couple of the books that I'm going to talk about tonight are based on utopias. One of them is more like your utopia is my dystopia, and one of them is they've created a utopian society within a larger dystopic society. So you can see them play out in different ways. A lot of times an author will portray a utopia as something that is negative, where power is instrumented on something. But I think it's really important to remember, especially when we're talking about what we can learn from it and an environmental stewardship, is that it needs to come from that balance of power. So, an important part of when I think about how I engage with a text, whether it's a movie, a poem, an actual book, an article, is I bring stuff with me. I bring baggage with me. I bring my prior knowledge. If you're in the honors college, you probably took Ways of Knowing. That's talking about your background and how you can bring your understanding into things. So Louise Rosenblatt, in 1938, she was an educator, talked about reader response theory. And reader response theory is acknowledging what you bring with you when you engage with something else, an event, a text, something like that. So that reader's prior knowledge allows you to think about the text in a similar way as someone else or in a vastly different way. That point of view becomes really important. And when you read anything, but specifically a dystopia, you put yourself in the place or you imagine what it's like to live in that future environment and how your past will help you in understanding the context of the power struggles within that text. When you read it, you build new knowledge. So you say, this is a new experience. It might not be something tangible that you've touched and engaged with, but it's something that you've mentally engaged with, which is as important. You've learned something through the words. You've learned something through the values of the author and through the protagonist within the story, the moral that it tends to tell you. It allows you to share and grow. And one of the things we'll do today, I will have some activities. You all hopefully have a 3x5 card, and if not, I will get them to you in a minute. But you're going to have an opportunity to share your thoughts and ideas with your neighbors. When you do that, that takes Louise Rosenblatt's idea of reader response theory one step further. When you learn something from yourself and what you engage with, and then you talk about that with somebody else, you increase your knowledge and your understanding. So you build those ideas. Okay, so the first part of the activity. Does anybody need a 3x5 card? My lovely assistant is going to help out here. Thank you very much. So what I'd like you to do is on one side of your 3x5 card, write down a dystopia that you have engaged with, that you've watched, that you've read, that you know about. In some way you've thought about a dystopia. And if you haven't, kind of think about something that might almost be a dystopia based upon the discussion that we've had. Underneath that title, or what that dystopia could be, write one or two words for the reaction. What was your reaction to engaging with that dystopia? And then you might have to remember a little bit back to what was your instinct and your reaction. And I'm going to give you about 60 seconds to fill this in. It's not a lot of time. But I could talk about dystopias probably for 2 hours, but you all want to go home before 9. I know you all thought you were just coming to a lecture and I wasn't going to actually make you do an assignment, but okay, I see a little writing still going on. That's good. I'll give you another couple seconds. Okay, come to a gentle pause. All right, what I'd like you to do now is spend a couple minutes talking to those around you. Share what your dystopia was, what's the title, and then also share what was your reaction, and then listen to what your partner had to say. You can do this with somebody next to you, you can turn around, you can create groups of 2 or 3, however you want to, but I really want you to hear what they said and what their reactions were, and think about the similarities and differences to what you have written down. Okay, I'm going to call you back together. My voice just broke. Okay. The talking part was the exciting part, right? To hear what everybody else had written down and what they had to say. What I'd like to do now is I want to call, well, actually I'm not going to call anybody. I would like some people to volunteer to say, this is what I read and this was my reaction. Also, talk a little loud enough that everybody in the room can hear you. Does somebody want to share? Yes, thank you.
I read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And I remember when I first read it, like, the first thing I felt was fear, just from, even though it's a little out there, it's still plausible that it could happen. And then anger that I could actually see that happening.
Excellent. So fear and anger for The Handmaid's Tale. Just a second, I will call on you next, but what I want to know is, did anybody else, by raise of hands, have fear or anger written on your page, on your paper? Good. Anyone else write The Handmaid's Tale down? All right, so what that shows us is that fear and anger can transcend different types of dystopias and different ways of reading. Good. Okay, up in the back, what did you have?
Yeah, I put The Happening down.
Okay.
And my 2 words were Nature's Revenge.
All right, The Happening and Nature's Revenge. Anybody else have nature or revenge written down? No nature or revenge. Hey, I thought this was the Wilderness and Civ lecture series. No, that's okay. Because it's interesting because nature is often a very underlying reaction to something. You don't think about the nature necessarily until after you've gone through your personal engagement of fear and anger. Okay, good. Somebody else. Way in the back, nice and loud.
The book 1 Second After.
Okay.
It's a great book about the apocalypse. And I wrote down Will Top.
What did you write down?
Will Top, or belief. That's exactly what I believe in.
Okay, belief, believe. Anybody else have belief? I mean, you said plausible. Plausible could be belief also. Okay, I would have put belief. I always fall into the stage of that could happen. All right, one more. In the black, right there.
Fahrenheit 451. I read this book a really, really long time ago when I was a lot younger and I did not understand the book whatsoever. So I guess I kind of felt confused and a little bit disgusted with how the society was.
Okay, confused and a little disgusted about the society. Ray Bradbury is awesome. He's really good with dystopias. How about anybody else? Confused or disgusted with the way the society? Confused? Okay, good. There's a lot of confusion because it goes against the grain of what we feel is, you know, the natural order of things. Good. So besides now going to collect all these at the very end, and I'll have a new list of dystopias to read, what it allows us to do is see those similarities and differences by the way that we engage and react. Not everybody engaged and reacted in the same way, but it allowed you a point for discussion, and you could say, yeah, I read that book, or I saw that movie, and I felt this way, and you felt that way. And then, well, what did you think about the society? So you start building those thoughts and those ideas that lead to the thinking about the way change works. And we'll talk a lot more about change. But what I want to do now is move into these 3 books. So choosing books to bring was really hard, or what I wanted to read from. And the reason I chose the title, Lessons Coming Through the Voice of Dystopia, It's because authors talk about dystopia in different ways. They represent a world that can make us fearful. They can represent a world that can make us very hopeful in the same way, even though we don't necessarily relate dystopia with hope very often. But I actually think that dystopias are very hopeful. So I chose, the first one I'm going to read to you from today is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. So Octavia Butler was a very prolific writer. She has written dystopia. She's written in many different genres. She's also written say, historical fiction. She writes from a perspective of Black America. And this particular book centers Lauren Olamina, who is our protagonist in this book. And Lauren is 15, 16 years old, and she lives in a walled city in Southern California, just on the outskirts of LA. And the government has fallen apart, and it's worldwide. It's not just in the United States. It's sort of a worldwide. Powers are disabled, and it's created a police state where the police are very corrupt. So if you had to call the fire department for, say, they might come, but they might not come, and then they would charge you money to put the fire out on your house. So most don't come. They live in communities, and they support each other. Within those communities, they raise gardens, they raise food, they have a community school. They kind of subsist in this little area, but outside of that wall, that neighborhood wall, is chaos. Well, something happens, and Lauren's neighborhood is wiped out, but she escapes. So I'm going to read a part. I put page numbers on here if you ever are at home and you're like, well, what page did she read from? You can look back at this. Lauren has picked up a band of people that are following with her, and she's walking north on the 101 highway up California. And this is a passage that highlights how a natural resource such as water becomes a crucial component of survival, not necessarily finding a stream and purifying it, but the fact that you have to purchase this, and it's very, very dangerous. And Lauren keeps a diary through this. So Wednesday, August 4th, 2027. Today we stopped at a commercial water station and filled ourselves and our containers with clean, safe water. Commercial stations are the best for that. Anything you buy from a water peddler on the freeway ought to be boiled and still might not be safe. Boiling kills disease organisms, but may not do anything to get rid of the chemical residue, fuel, pesticide, herbicide, whatever else has been in the bottles that the peddlers use. The fact that most peddlers can't read makes this situation worse. They sometimes poison themselves. Commercial stations let you draw whatever you pay for and not a drop more, right out of one of their taps. You drink whatever the local householders are drinking. It might taste, smell, or look bad, but you can depend on it not to kill you. There aren't enough water stations. That's why water peddlers exist. Also, water stations are dangerous places. People going in have money. People coming out have water, which is as good as money. Beggars and thieves hang around such places, keeping the whores and drug dealers company. So this gives an idea of what a natural resource could be in a dystopia. You can't live as a human without water. So yet you have to be able to, in some way, create a system for yourself to be able to afford something like that. Or, I guess you could be the peddler and the thieves. So Lauren continues north, looking for a place where her band, her group of people can settle. Throughout the entire book, she writes in her diary about the earth seed, which turns out to be somewhat of a religion. Octavia Butler talks about when she wrote the book, how she was looking for a faith. She was looking for something to believe in herself, and she drew from many different spiritual backgrounds to create this idea for Lauren Olamina that would give power and at least sort of help bring a group of people together under a belief system. So belief was one of our words, or plausible was something that came out of it. At the end of the book, they found a space that they think that they will be able to survive. they have lost many loved ones along the journey, and they haven't buried them. They haven't, many of them burned in fires. So they hold a mass for all of their people that have died along the way, basically saying goodbye. And Lauren's contribution to this was to plant acorns, because acorn meal was an important part of their diet. So this was going to help reestablish a place of living for them, and also paying tribute and saying goodbye to their loved ones. But this is what she writes in her Earth Seed, so her parable, her religion of sorts. And it's centered on change, which, as we know and understand, environment and nature are always in flux and always in change. And there has to be some sort of give and take between humans and nature to allow for both to subsist. This is where that idea of sustainability, of stewardship comes into play. So for Lauren, who at this point is now 17, she writes, "Create no image of God, except the images that God has provided. They are everywhere, in everything. God is change. Seed to tree, tree to forest, rain to river, river to sea, grubs to bees, bees to swarm, from one, many, from many, one, forever uniting, growing, dissolving, forever changing. The universe is God's self-portrait." So she pulls this together at the end to kind of create that give and take and that back and forth. I think she does this very beautifully. For me, as a reader, when I engage with this book, I am not a religious person per se, but I found the spirituality in this passage to be really moving. And I was able to see the connections between what she was trying to tell me with change and people, and change and the universe, and change in the earth and the nature. So when I finished this book, I thought, and I've read it several times now. It's also really good on audiobook. I've listened to it that way. For me, it made me think about chaos and uncertainty and what it means to ground oneself in what you can understand and what you know. And for me, I really identified with Lauren Olamina's desire to find place and to create a place to provide for those that she loved and that she found and were important. And through that, she continued those words to help others. So for me, I had this sense of connection that came from that. And it was really a nature moving point for me with this particular book. Okay, we're going to switch directions just a little bit and talk about uglies. I know your heads are pounding and you want to keep thinking about Octavia Butler's, and you're going to get a chance to after we talk about all three of the books, because they're different, but I want you to also find that thread of connectedness through them. Okay. Oh, just before I go on. So I really like the visual aspects that you can get from PowerPoint. So this is an acorn and a person hiking and moving through it. I found that on Google. Just was like, wow, this is a perfect one. So everything that I've picked also image-wise ties in to the book that I'm reading. Okay, uglies. So of the three books that I'm sharing with you today, this one is by far the most young adults. Most of the folks that I've talked to that have read this book have been in the 12, 13, 14-year-old range. When I ask adults to read it, they engage with it in a vastly different way. But I'm going to read first this time instead of telling you about the protagonist, because the first line of this book is a doozy. The early summer sky was the color of cat vomit. Of course, Tally thought, you'd have to feed your cat only salmon-flavored cat food for a while to get the pinks right. The scudding clouds did look a bit fishy, rippled into scales by a high-altitude wind. As the light faded, deep blue gaps of night peered through like an upside-down ocean, bottomless and cold. I don't know about you, but I rarely describe a sunset as cat vomit, or in a negative way at all. Even on the smoggiest, most inverted days, the sunset still, to me, has this sense of things are closing down, new stuff is going to happen, and I find the colors to be pleasant, even though I know that it's all because of dirty air that they're really nice. I still enjoy the colors. It's this sentence with all of my teenagers who read this book was the most impactful sentence in probably the first 200 pages. It takes a little while to get into the book, but still, that first sentence, they're like, nobody describes a sunset that way. Nobody. But it really leads you into thinking about how does Tally think about her environment? Why is the environment described in a way that you wouldn't? What does Tally not have in her background that you do that allows you to engage with a sunset in such a different way? So Tally Youngblood is a 15, almost 16-year-old girl who lives in Uglytown. And she cannot wait to turn 16 and go to Pretty Town. And she's going to take a little stopover at the hospital on the way to Pretty Town, where she's going to have cosmetic surgery that all 16-year-olds get from Uglytown to Pretty Town. That cosmetic surgery was imposed by the government of Pretty Town so that there would not be difference, so that everyone would be the same height. They would have within a median the same skin tone, the same hair texture, the same eye color. They would act and behave very similarly. So what Tally doesn't know is she also will get an implant that creates a brain lesion that makes her docile. Here's where that dystopia comes in part, you know, oh, that's not good. Nobody wants their freedoms taken away. But Tally can't wait for this because it's her belief system. It's everything that she's been raised with, that this is what happens. This is my rite of passage. I'm going to be 16. I will have arrived in Pretty Town with my friends where I won't ever have to worry about anything again. Well, because it is a coming of age story, Tally meets somebody who doesn't believe the same way that she does. And this leads to her sort of awakening an understanding of many things. The beauty of difference, and that includes the beauty of difference in nature. So I'm going to read to you a section that kind of highlights the way this society got to this point. So Pretty Town is considered the utopia. Like they've created a good society where nothing is happening. Only they're all suppressed and happy because of brain lesions, but they don't know that, so they're happy, so it's okay. But yet there's this other thing that happened to create this environment. So this is Tally describing what she remembers from her history classes, what she learned from the past that has led to this. She's talking about some ruins that she can see. Seeing them now at night, the ruins felt much more real to Tally. On school trips, the teachers always made the Rusties out to be so stupid. You almost couldn't believe people lived like this, burning trees to clear land, burning oil for heat and power, setting the atmosphere on fire with their weapons. But in the moonlight, she could imagine people scrambling over flaming cars to escape the crumbling city, panicked in their flight from the untenable pile of metal and stone. So this passage describes a history. You know, we burn oil. We burn trees, we fire weapons, the sky, we use flamethrowers. That's probably a representation of our present. But in Tally's present, the environment is taken care of and it is revered, but you don't touch it because you're happy pills in your Pretty Town and you don't have to deal with it. So it becomes this other thing and not something that you are a steward of or engage with. A little bit later, poor Tally gets sent by the people in charge to go find her best friend who's teaching her all about this difference. And she has to live on her own and for about 2 weeks, not too long, but out in the world. She's never been in nature before. And here she is, tromping through the woods, trying to find her friend Shay, who has gone to live with the resistance, where they, live off the land and burn trees and take care of the earth. So right before she finds Shay, her friend, She has this experience with a flower, and she learns something about the earth that she didn't know about. So the flower used to be one of the rarest plants in the world, a white tiger orchid. In Rusty days, a single bulb was worth more than a house. A house? But there's zillions of them. You noticed? He held up the flower, staring into its delicate mouth. About 300 years ago, some Rusty figured a way to engineer the species to adapt to wilder conditions. She messed with the genes to make them propagate more easily. Why? The usual, to trade them for lots of stuff. But she succeeded a little too well. Look down. Tally peered out the window. The machine had gained altitude and left the firestorm behind. Below were endless fields of white, interrupted only by a few barren patches. Looks like she did a good job. So what? They're nice. They're pretty. One of the most beautiful plants in the world, but too successful, they turned into the ultimate weed, what we call a monoculture. They crowd out every other species, choke trees and grass, and nothing eats them except one species of hummingbird which feeds on their nectar, but the hummingbirds nest in trees. There aren't any trees down there, Tally said, just the orchids. Exactly. That's what a monoculture means. Everything is the same. After enough orchids build up in an area, there aren't enough hummingbirds to pollinate them. You know, to spread the seeds. Yeah, Tally said. I know about the birds and the bees. Sure you do, kid. So the orchids eventually die out, victims of their own success, leaving a wasteland behind. Biological zero. We rangers try to keep them from spreading. We've tried poison, engineered diseases, predators to target the hummingbirds, but fire is the only thing that really works. He turned the orchid over in his hand and held up a fire starter, letting the flame lick into its mouth. Have to be careful, you know. Tally noticed the other rangers were cleaning their boots and uniforms, searching for any trace of the flowers among the mud and foam. She looked down at the endless white. And you've been doing this for almost 300 years. The Rusties started the job after they figured out what they'd done, but we'll never win. All we can hope to do is contain the weed. So this section is talking about a monoculture and related to the orchid. But a reader who's reading through this begins to see the connections between a monoculture of the human and the monoculture of the orchid, and begins making ideas and connections with diversity and how diversity is a positive thing and a beautiful thing versus an ugly thing, which is what Tally thinks of in the beginning. One last section on this one. So Tally goes through an immense amount of change in this book. It's a dense one. It's a series. You can spend a lot of time reading 4 of these books that lead through these different aspects. Tally's not always the heroine, but she's always involved in the books in some particular way. She becomes the steward of nature through the 4 books, which is kind of an interesting projection from someone who was anti-everything to then the protector of the earth, basically, and the protector of difference. So this last section is a direct opposite to the first lines. The physical beauty of the smoke also cleared her mind of worries. Every day seemed to change the mountain. Every day seemed to change the mountain, the sky, and the surrounding valleys, making them spectacular in the completely new way. Nature, at least, didn't need an operation to be beautiful. It just was. So you're going to see that change. So how I engaged with this book, and I'll let you think about engaging with the words in a couple of minutes, but when I read this book the first time, I was like, wow, cosmetic surgery, you know, the golden mean, the way people look. And I was really fixated on the way that our current culture represents beauty and difference, and how that media, how all of that tends to portray it in particular ways. The second and the third time that I read this book, I thought about it more in a broader sense of how does that engage, you know, why did the Rusties, our time frame, have these things that took place? What were the apocalyptic things that happened that led to a culture that only looked at beauty as one dimension in this particular way? So I began thinking about my own space and what that meant and what that looked like. After engaging with it a third time with a group of teenage girls and a group of women my age who had read it, I began looking at it in a vastly different way even again. I looked at Tally's individual power that she gains through this to become the steward of nature and of the earth, and how she affected that with that change in power that she gained, how she could also become a social activist. And that social activism allowed her to talk to other groups, to work with other people, to create change and combat the utopia that was creating lesions in people's heads and making them happy but unhappy kind of way. So she becomes not only an individual agent, but also a social agent, which is really an important aspect to think of what you learn from a dystopia. Okay, one more. This one is not a young adult dystopia. This one, I would say, is an adult dystopia. Okay, it's not cat vomit. It's pretty. I had a really hard time trying to decide what cat vomit looked like when I was looking at pink sunsets. Okay, The Fifth Sacred Thing. So Starhawk, as an author, she is also an academic. She teaches at several different universities in California. Samuels College is one of them. She also travels the world as a speaker on permaculture. If you look her up, she has phenomenal YouTube videos on sustainability, on permaculture, on community agriculture. And this book fits into those themes, but is a utopia, dystopia, and fiction. However, out of all of the books, I mean, I know 2027 is really close, right? That's when this one took place in the future. That's close. This one is like now. 2015. It's like when they talked about Back to the Future happening in 2015 a couple years ago. It's kind of amazing to think about, well, how does that look like now? So dystopias that are actually happening now, there's some really interesting parallels to those things. This book is written from the sense of a utopia. So in Starhawk's book, California, centered in California again, falls under a militarized rule. And the militarized rule came about through the privatization of water. So if you've been to California, you may have recognized or seen at some point in time there's a large aqueduct that runs from basically Sacramento all the way down to the ocean just south of LA. And it's an open aqueduct. Water just runs through it. Even in a drought, water runs through that from one end to the other, and farmers draw from that all down Central California, where they are watering olive groves and almond trees and everything that we like to eat in the winter that in Montana that we don't get to grow. And they covered it up. And they covered it up, the government covered it up because it was evaporating. So if we cover it up, less water will evaporate. But what also happens when you cover it up, it becomes hard to access. Oh, well, you have to pay for that access. You have to pay more for that access. You don't get that access, but you get that access. When you can't pay for it, well, you get the farm and the access, you don't get the farm anymore. So it became this rolling sort of thing until everybody who was in power was this one particular group. And they marched north. So they centered from down in Southern California, and they moved northward, taking over as they went, covering up the aqueduct, moving towards Sacramento. And they get to the Bay Area, and they reach Resistance. And it's this community that resists this group, and they were situated in an area that was hard to take over, so it had some natural defensible barriers. And of course, the Bay Area is a hotbed of, radicals always. Berkeley, this is where it centers. So it's really this awesome connection to history in that particular way as well. The section that I'm going to read is basically the history of this utopia and how it came to be. The leaders of the utopia talk about this every year just before the raining season, because the growth and what they create from the farms and the water from the rain basically keeps the entire group alive throughout the year. So as the rains come, every year they tell this story. A deep hush fell over the crowd. Maya went on. This moon brings a time of hope and danger, fire season. We watch the dry hills anxiously, knowing that rains are weeks or months away. Those of us who are old have seen fire destroy our drought-baked cities and smoke eclipse the sun. We've seen rich croplands shrivel into the grass-hard deserts and the earth itself collapse on its emptied water table. We have seen diseases claim our children and our lovers and our neighbors. We know it can happen again. We hope for a harvest. We pray for rain, but nothing is certain. We say that harvest will only be abundant if the crops are shared, that the rains will not come unless water is conserved and shared and respected. We believe we can continue to live and thrive only if we care for one another. This is the age of the reaper, when we inherit 5,000 years of postponed results, the fruits of our callousness toward the earth and toward other human beings. But at last we have come to understand that we are part of the earth, part of the air, the fire, and the water, as we are part of one another. She paused for a moment. Her voice dropped, becoming lighter, almost conversational. We've had 2 blessed decades to remake our corner of the world, to live by what we believe. Today is the 20th anniversary of the uprising. I've been asked to tell you the story of Las Cuatro Viejas, the 4 old women who sparked the rebellion in 28, when the stewards canceled the elections and declared martial law. On Shotwell Street, down below the slopes of this hill, which in the time was called Burnell Heights, lived a woman, Maria, whose grandmother grew fruit trees in the backyard from peach pits and avocado pits, and she saved her tomato seeds. While the stewards' troops were massing down on the peninsula, commandeering all stockpiles of food, and the rest of us were debating what to do and trying to work up courage to do it, Maria gathered together with her neighbors, Alice Black, Lily Fong, and Greta Jean Margolis, 4 old women with nothing to lose. On the morning of the 1st of August, they marched out into the dawn with pickaxes over their shoulders, straight out into the middle of Army Street. And all the traffic stopped, such cars as few people could still afford to drive. Some of them were honking their horns, some were shouting threats. But when Maria raised the pickaxe above her head, there came a silence like a great shared indrawn breath. Then she let it fall with a thud that shuddered through the street, and the 4 old women began to dig. They tore up the pavement blow by blow and filled the holes with compost from a sack Greta carried and planted them with seeds. By then a crowd had gathered. The word was carried through the streets, and we rushed from our houses to join them, bringing tools or our own bare hands, eager to build something new. And many of us were crying with joy or with fear, tears streaming enough to water the seeds. But Alice raised her hand and she called out in a loud voice, "Don't you cry," she told us. "This is not a time to cry. This is a time to rejoice and praise the earth, because today we have planted our freedom." Then we joined them, tearing up the streets as the cars backed away from us, piling up barricades on the freeways, smashing the doors of the locked warehouses. And those who were supported the stewards fled south with all the goods they could steal. And we who remained planted seeds, and we guarded the sources of water in the valleys and the mountains, and the stewards withdrew to starve us out. We were hungry, so very hungry, for a long time while we waited for the seeds to grow and prayed for rain and danced for rain. It was a long, dry season, but we had pledged to feed one another's children first with what food we had, and to share what we had. And so the food we shared became sacred to us, and the water and the air and the earth became sacred. When something is sacred, it can't be bought or sold. It is beyond price, and nothing that might harm it is worth doing. What is sacred becomes the measure by which everything is judged. And this is our measure and our vow to the life-renewing rain. We will not be waterers, we will not be wasters, but healers. So this is the story that is recited every year as a way to tell the history to the new people within that utopia. That's in the beginning of the book. The rest of the book follows the protagonist who ends up having to protect that utopia from the stewards or the dystopia. So it's, in this case, slightly different from what I wrote about before, your utopia is by dystopia. In this case, this would be a reverse of that, where the dystopia actually produced the positive aspect of the utopia, that from that dystopia, something positive could be built. When I read this book the first time, it was just before I moved to California. And it actually talks a lot about the area that I ended up living in, San Luis Obispo, where there's a nuclear reactor. In the book, she blows up the nuclear reactor. It's a big deal. People survived, interestingly enough. But living in that area that was so connected to agriculture as a way of life, and also policed in particular ways between private and non-private lands, especially living in the area with the nuclear reactor, is a very odd space to have to inhabit. And this book really made me think about what does that mean to live in those areas of margin. It also makes me think about now, when we think about the protection of our natural lands, what do we have? Our national parks, our state parks, our monuments, and what does it mean to be a public space versus a private space? And how do we own or not own spaces, or allow or disallow access? And this book really made me think about the juxtaposition of dystopia and utopia. So I liked it for that. I probably could stand to read this one a couple more times. She just came out with a sequel, which I haven't read yet, so I'll have to try that one. And this is actually a photograph, or a picture from, she's doing a Kickstarter, Starhawk is, to raise money to create a film. All the proceeds from her books, and then also from the film, go towards her permaculture work that she does around the world, which is kind of interesting. Okay, I'm doing all right. So I just got to tell you about 3 of my favorite books in dystopias and how I engaged with that. I got to tell you a little bit about my history, where I come from, how I know what I know, only a little bit. But I got to then talk through how I engaged with the words that I shared with you. So what? You're like, that's nice. Maybe I'll go read those books, or I'll think about dystopias in slightly different ways, or your current situation and how that projects to the future. But there are takeaways and food for thought for this. I think my number one takeaway from a dystopia, and why I think that they're so powerful, is that they do breed hope. All of the dystopias that I've ever read situate at least one, if not many, interconnected power issues and struggles that lead towards a solution. And it's not an individual solution, they're almost always social solutions. So if you engage at one level with a protagonist, a hero or a heroine in the book, you have to think about the ways that that hero and that heroine engage in a larger social context. What I learned from reading dystopias are ways for me to be able to engage in active ways. Some of it is what I do here tonight when I talk about how you can read a story and what the word means when you take it with you and leave. Most people read fiction for fun and for an escape, but you're always left with something. It doesn't go away. You don't turn it off. It doesn't just cease to exist. It creates something within you, and what I would encourage you and sort of charge you to do is to think a little more metacognitively. So think about your thinking. That's what metacognition means. So you have to think about your thinking while you're doing it, and then share that thinking by talking about it with other people. This is why book clubs are so wonderful. This is why discussion in a classroom is so great. This is why dialogue in a community is so important, because it allows those different perspectives to be shared, and it allows you to learn and grow from that, to be active in your learning and active in your pursuit of whatever it is you choose to do. So the last thing that I want you to do is more activity. So I just told you about my reminder of the research. So it's complicated, it's interwoven, there are things tied together. I don't expect you to read and connect with everything. You might read and connect with one thing. You might read Fahrenheit 457 again, 51, as an adult in a different state of mind, and think about it in a vastly different way. You'll still remember the way you read it in one context, but you get to add to it and think differently about it in another way. The same thing goes for rereading these or reading them first time, watching movies, same way of engagement. So on the back of your 3x5 card, I want you to take a minute to jot down a question or a comment. This is a moment for let you sit with the things that I've talked about today and the words that I read to you, the voices of these dystopias, and how they made you think in relationship to what I read, what I'm talking about, who you are, and maybe what this lecture series means to you. So that all might all come together. One question, two questions. At the end, I would like to collect these. You don't have to turn it in if you don't want to. No names on these. But I would like to know your thoughts. I will also work on transcribing them and getting them to Natalie so that she can post them so that you can see what everybody else's questions and thoughts were. We'll share some of those, but I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to kind of think about and sit with dystopias. While you're doing it, I'm going to share this last one. You can read this. That's January 24th. Dystopias are a big deal these days. Okay. I'd like to open up for questions or discussion or comments or. Yes.
I guess I just wrote, like, I wonder if people from, let's say, 200 years ago or 500 years ago, if they would view our current lifestyles as dystopias or.
Awesome. So people from 200, 500 years ago, would they view our present day as a dystopia or a utopia? What do you think? Yes? Say that again?
That's who you ask.
Depends who you ask. Point of view is important, right? Good. Anybody else? Yeah.
I've sort of, a lot of dystopias, dystopian fiction is like about dismantling the dystopia. But I was kind of wondering, how do we use the lessons from these stories to prevent dystopias from happening?
Good question. Okay, so dystopias, and she said, often the story deconstructs the dystopia. But how do we take that and learn from it? How do we keep it from happening? Anybody have any ideas? Yes.
Well, I think the trick I was thinking about, is that with these people that live through the actual dystopian time, it's how normal, it's how they all feel until it's too late to come around and realize what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you really have to dig deep and think about if what these changes are happening are normal, and if they are they right?
Right. I think that's excellent. So being able to use like an internal barometer of what is normal and not normal, or right and not right. But it does mean that, and I think for me personally, what I get from reading dystopias and how I use them as lessons for myself is this something I feel so strongly about that I feel at the core of myself that this is something that is not right or is going to impact my future or my society's future. What can I do? What actions can I have? What power do I have to affect change? I think you see a lot of that right now. If we just take the last couple of weeks, for example, and you look at the Women's March, those women saw something, felt something, and it created a moment for them that they had to act. And this was a coalescing action. So you saw a social movement. Before you ever saw that social movement, there were individuals who said, I don't agree with what's going on. I have to do something. And that person might be like, I don't agree what's going on, Aaron, what are we going to do? And what do? We went and marched, right? Yes. Okay, so you begin finding those things, and that's where you find that society. I think one of the things that young adult literature does as a disservice to the social aspect is it always puts forward the protagonist's power first. And that's important for young adults. It's important to be able to find your power, your inner power, but it doesn't necessarily translate itself into social action and social change for whatever you feel most deeply about, what that becomes your passion and your care. It's also important not to look at your passion and your care as this so many things that you can't be passionate about it. I mean, I think about my kids and they're like, I want to do this, 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 and this. And I'm like, nope. We're not going to do all those things. Pick one or two things that you're going to focus on. Focus on those things until you feel you've accomplished something. Then you can choose and move to somewhere else. It's the same thing I tell my students. You can be really, really good at composition in this particular way. Great, you've mastered that. Now let's look at it in this particular way. But I think that's one of the most fundamental questions to ask when you engage with reading and when you engage with a dystopia is, what do I feel? And what can I do? Where's my power and where can I affect change? Awesome. Somebody else want to share? Yes. He's pointing this way, and I don't see out of my left eye so well, but so go ahead.
I just wrote that I like how dystopian literature usually utilizes fear to kind of help instill the lessons that I learned through the books. And I like that that's kind of fighting fire with fire, because a lot of these dystopian outcomes are due to fear-mongering governments, people that utilize fear to instill their dystopian culture. And I like that that's kind of like a parallel there. That books kind of use that fear to help us get motivated to not let that happen.
Right. You don't want to live that fear. Yes.
Yeah, I just think it's important to recognize that, yeah, it's here now, you know. This world is it's not something that's coming anymore, you know.
So there are a lot of dystopias that we're living right now. And there are a lot of people who live dystopias, right?
Yeah,
Syrian refugees, that's a pretty fat dystopia for those people. Yeah.
So just to recognize that it's not something to be planned for in the future, that it's here now.
So the action that you do today, and I think that's important to think about, and I kind of touched it on the beginning. Authors write dystopias mainly because they have these fears or these concerns, socially or individually, about particular things. These three authors did specifically in Scott Westerfeld, in the way that young girls represent beauty, or even the young culture represents beauty, and disrespects nature and difference. Starhawk on how the stewardship of the land had been separated out in some particular ways. And Octavia Butler in the spirituality and the understanding of change and survival. But a dystopia allows for you to look at that fear and displace it from yourself, to think about how you would react. But it's not meant for you to react about it in a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. It's meant for you to react right now, so that you take what you've learned and what you've gleaned and find that passion that you're going to be active around, and then do something about it. Live your life in a particular different way. It's not necessarily like a self-help book, you know, that you might pick up off the shelf and read on how to be a better student or how to be, you know, a more organized or something. It's not step by step. It has to kind of come from inside, and you have to kind of find that fire and know that that's where the change is going to situate. Yes?
I thought it was interesting you were talking about, like, you know, how there's this kind of individual vision of not really knowing how to be interdependent. You know, so we have this vision, but how are we effectively communicating that with other people, and realizing that we have to kind of work together to make manifest that vision. You know, we can't do it all by ourselves. I feel like, you know, as Americans especially, we're so good at being independent, but the interdependence is really lacking. So
I think you're, you know, right on the money with that. I think that's definitely, as other cultures do it as well, but U.S. Americans are very, very good at saying, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You are in charge of your own destiny. You can do this, you can be this all on your own. But what we know is nobody actually really does it on your own. You have support systems and privileges and things that are put into place that allow you to succeed or allow you to have a different aspect to succeed. And that's where we see these, divergent, where people do different things. What we are not as good about is coming together and coalescing with groups and working together as groups. I mean, you can look at when we ask employers, what are you looking for from our students? The top two things they ask for are critical thinking skills and ability to work in teams, teamwork. Not to be able to lead the team, but to be able to work in the team. And this is something in the last 20 to 30 years has really moved and shifted in this country so that we are very much, I can do this, I am the best at this, I can do this, and we've been told this over and over again. So how do we break through that mold of individuality and begin to see how to work together in a network, in a group? Some of that is through reading, some of it's through being inquiry-based, really engaging in seminars like this, doing critical thinking that allows you to teamwork together, and really being aware of when do you step back and give someone else power, and when do you step forward and they allow you to take power. So it's that negotiation that allows for something bigger instead of just your way or the highway. I think it's very important. Great comment. Yes, go ahead.
So this is the Wilderness Issues lecture series.
Yes, it is.
And I thought it was interesting in the second book. It almost seemed like the wilderness concept or our modern idea of wilderness was presented as a dystopian idea. You were talking about that place where nature was intact,
Yep.
functioning, but that's because you couldn't touch it.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
As opposed to the society outside that was using those resources.
Yep.
And I don't know, I thought it was interesting that kind of is our wilderness concept and it's presented as being dystopian.
Yeah, that here is our national park, we're going to preserve it. Here are the rules and the construction of it. Or in Uglies, in this case, it's safe to live in the city, in the town, and they're not thinking straight because they have the lesions in their head, but that what they're told and what they end up believing is that they are conservationists, that they're actually doing the right thing by preserving this wilderness, by not engaging with it because it is dangerous, it's fearful. In the past history, they decimated it and we didn't have whatever it is, oxygen or whatever it is they needed from it. Absolutely, it's a really interesting way to consider the dystopic aspect, to putting something so far away that you're not allowed to engage with it. Yeah, go ahead.
I've always felt like that's one of the major flaws with our wilderness and protected area management system, is it creates this psychological barrier of, wilderness is something apart from us. And I totally feel like we need wilderness areas, but we also need to incorporate the idea of wilderness into urban environments.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Grand Teton National Park, just outside Grand Teton National Park, and I worked in Grand Teton National Park. And if any of you have been there, it is this pristine, amazing wilderness. The Teton Wilderness is just like phenomenal, but very few people go there. What they do is they're driving to Yellowstone and they drive in this loop like this and they come back out and they fly out of Jackson and they head off somewhere. Or they drive through to Bozeman and they get on a plane and they go somewhere. We've created safe spaces to engage with nature, right? But there's fear of engaging with a campground, right? Even something that's just off of the paved road, right? There's fear in that. Bugs, going to the bathroom. I was a river guide. People the concept that cows are not actually wild animals. I mean, there's some very different connections with what wilderness means for different people. And I think we could do a much better job of making it less fearful and more engaging and learn a lot more from it. Last comment in the back.
Like, I'm from right outside of Chicago, so, like, but it's very heavily suburb, but we have a lot of, like, forest preserves, and I was saying how there's, like, I view different types of labels for, like, different things, like, I view the wilderness different than, like, the forest, and then the woods are completely different from the forest. Because, like, where I'm from, when the woods and, like, forest preserves, that's where people go to hook up, party, and do a lot of drugs. So that's like a fearful place for me.
Unsafe. Yeah, okay, good.
And then, like, when I go to like a national park, I'm just like, well, this is like still people come here to kind of do the same thing, but it's a lot more toned down because it's more controlled and like controlled stuff. And then the wilderness is just something that's open and like almost anything can happen. But I still feel it's safer than the woods by my house.
Probably is. I don't know for sure. Oh, but that's a really interesting thing to think about, though, is because people, based upon the knowledge and their background and their histories, engage with wildness or wilderness in vastly different ways. Excellent. Thank you all so much for letting me come and talk to you today. And if you would let me have your cards, I would really, really appreciate it. You can actually just leave them on the edge of the tables. Thank you very much. Yeah.